Welcome to episode 27 of Randall Vision. I am your host, Randall. Today, doing something hard. Part of life is doing things that are difficult. And one of the purposes of this channel is to get around to talking about what I want to talk about today. Some events in my life that, to say these things out loud, to say to a single individual, it's not that big a deal. You could have a conversation about it. To say it to a group of people, they might think you're a little weird. And to say it in public to, every human that has internet access or to put this up on YouTube. I don't know, there's a lot of stigma around mental health. There's stigma around drug use. So telling a story like this jeopardizes your credibility, your employment potential. I personally, I don't think it would harm the relationships with anyone in my family. That these people know me. They know I've been through some weird stuff. So whenever they hear this, I don't think any of my family or friends would think any less of me on account of this story. Many of them have already heard it. But to say it out loud in public, that's the hard part. So I don't know. I've got a few disclaimers already on the channel. I don't know if I need to really reiterate any. All the episodes up until this point was kind of establishing context or setting the stage for these kinds of stories. Like the one I'm going to tell today is like one of the biggest and most dramatic. It's the one that probably resembles a parable the most. But I've got like at least a dozen of these stories. And part of all the context that I laid down before this is kind of like I've cobbled back together my theory of everything. And I've already kind of laid it all out. And I don't claim the ideas to be original. I collected them throughout the world and stuck them together. And so a lot of the points that I've talked about so far are some of the stronger elements that comprise my worldview and that kind of stuff. So, where else are we going here? A little more setup for this story. So in general, I may have made allusions to this, but so my whole life, I've kind of been dedicated to something that I've noticed there's communities involved in this, but when we're young or maybe in adolescence, by that point it's usually happened, and maybe it doesn't happen to people until they're an adult, and some people it never happens to, but some of us are drawn to or perplexed by a question or a feeling, and it can blow your mind, like how perfect the world seems sometimes, and to think that what we do during our day-to-day mundane activities is it. Like, how could something as grand as the universe exists, and then the purpose of it to be me to sleep, bathe, eat, socialize, educate, work, be educated, work, all of that's it. Like there has to be something else here. So people start looking for answers, and religions are designed to offer answers to those questions. The real answers can't be put into words. So institutions like religions may seem like they're full of shit to certain people, because in essence it is. All the words are wrong, because the thing that they're trying to talk about you can't describe it with words. But it exists. Anyhow, I'm getting a little off the point here. So going through my life, I've learned these terms. A seeker, I think some people call it a seeker. I've seen the word shaman come up a few times recently instead of just like the hand-me-down definition, a secondary definition that I like is an individual functioning on their own, kind of like a scientist, but instead of having large pools of data, the only pool of data that counts is observed by that individual or whatever. So like, I turned my life into a science experiment. I wanted to know all the big answers. Is there a God? If so, what's the nature of it? What's time? What's space? What is consciousness? What's the limits of consciousness? That's like kind of like the core fundamental. And I feel like I approached it scientifically, and I took notes. Starting at the age, I believe 16, I kept running journals of like all of my conclusions, all of my findings, everything, what bothers me about the world, how am I supposed to understand this, all of that. So I put effort into these. They were like my prized possession. Once I'd finish one, it would go on the shelf and I'd start a new one. And I'd generally like take them everywhere with me. And whenever the mood struck me, I would make an entry. And usually it would be, most of my inspiration came around substance use. That just whatever I would write while sober just never was good. And not that the things that I wrote when I was like high or drunk or fucked up on whatever, not that stuff was good, but it was interesting. So in short, some of it was utter nonsense, or some of it only made context or made sense in the context of an altered state of consciousness. But I don't know. I think we've got enough preamble. Okay, so this story is part of my self-mythology. That the stories that I have about myself, and in particular, everything that occurred before this story, most of the documentation of those events are gone now. But since then, I didn't tell the story yet. So the self-mythology, the disclaimer I want to slap on this is that I've told the story several times. It's been about 7 or 8 years since this occurred. So my recollection is not going to be completely accurate, obviously. Eyewitness testimony, not a very good thing in court. even though I was the eyewitness. I do have one artifact from this story to grant it some sort of validity. And there were witnesses, like, that I don't live in a vacuum. There's people in my life, and there have been people in my life. So, all right. So this is a story that kind of involves, well, the inciting, what seemed to have been the lead domino in this chain of events was an acid trip. And I don't know, like, in my 30s, I didn't trip nearly as much as my teens and my 20s. That was like when it was more available and I was more willing or able to do it. Whenever I got older, it just, not that it lost its appeal, but it's like my attitudes towards it, and like, it was no longer something that got me high. It was like, oh, we're gonna go to church. So I don't remember the details of like day or night or whatever, but I recall tripping with, I believe it was my girlfriend at the time and a roommate we had. And at one point I was like, haha, ta-da, I did it. And I like hopped forward, standing in the living room, and they were like, what happened? What'd you do? And I was like, well, I just subjugated all known deities to beneath myself. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I was like, yeah, I put myself above them. And they're like, well, how'd you do that? And I was like, well, I just thought it. And in the moment, it made a lot of sense to me. And now in hindsight, the way I would digest that a little more is that, like, consciousness does things. Like, when you just think about stuff, it does things, and we may not see the product of that, but it happens. Like, there's somewhere where the things that we think, like, manifest. We're like projecting thought forms or some shit. And to have done what I did, it was naive. It was innocent. Like, I wasn't like trying to be like, oh, I'm better than gods, it was, oh, I never thought to do this before. Let's try it and see what happens. So, the events play out, and okay, I had my trip or whatever. In the coming days, shit got real weird. And the most of which, this may have been the following day or so. This is where it gets pretty wild. I'm pretty sure. So I'm home alone. It's daytime, and I'm in the kitchen, and I just got done with a phone call with my mom. She was living out in Colorado, and I was talking about plans for the future. Shit was kind of weird, like, at that time, that, like, didn't have a lot going for me. Too much bills, not enough income. And I was like, yeah, Mom, so I've been working on these notebooks, and, like, I think I'm just going to self-publish them. That, like, I feel like they're important. This is my life's work. I know they kind of suck, but I just want to, like, scan them and have my handwritten pages printed in book form. And I've got a 6 books worth of material, and I'll start selling them. And in general, she was always supportive and all that, so she didn't see anything wrong with what I was doing, and that was it. We hung up. So then I'm sitting there, and a feeling starts to come over me. And it was gradual, and at first it was just general uneasiness. And I was like, okay, this is weird. And it escalated. It kept creeping up, and like it was a really hard to describe feeling, like just being uncomfortable in my skin, like the inside my skin was not a good place to be. And to try to push that away, I attempted to ignore it and tried to wash some dishes. And that made me feel worse. And I'm like, okay, this ain't good. And then I go and grab a cheap beer out of the fridge. And I start drinking it. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's not really helping. And then something like made contact. The thing that whatever was causing this uneasy feeling to me, I don't know if it made contact first, or I was so distressed by the situation that I started pleading with whatever was causing it. And when I did, the thing communicated. And it was me trying to strike a deal. Like, if this feeling would continue, I would have had to kill myself. Not out of depression, but like the way whatever was causing me to feel was becoming unbearable. So to make this deal, I start making offers to this thing, and I'm like, well, hey, what do you want? I'm kind of, obviously you're the one in control here. I'm not, so what do I got to do? And it was the notebooks. It wanted me to get rid of them. And I was like, but that's my life's work. And it would accept nothing less than that. So I took my notebooks out into the backyard. I doused them in gasoline and I set them on fire. And I stood there and with a stick and poked them until they were all burnt. And the pain stopped. So the books were gone. To say it was my life's work is not an understatement. It was the only thing that mattered to me. I was trying to figure out the answers, and I was taking notes. And so my entire theory of everything, what explained all of my existence and my purpose in life, was gone. In the following days, things were still weird. I didn't want to kill myself anymore, but I started having significant cognitive issues. One was I was still working at the fancy beer store, and this is the most significant full-blown hallucination I recall, but there was like I was cleaning taps, and then like the bucket was empty, and I was texting, and she said, "Get back to work." And I thought to myself, yeah, okay, as soon as I fill up this bucket and I drop my rag into the empty bucket, and then the bucket was full of hot water. And not warm water, the water was hot. Like, had the bucket already been full, had I filled it up in the other room and brought it over and then it been sitting there for several minutes, it wouldn't have been that warm. But not only did it go from empty to full, the full one was hot, as if it had just been drawn. So that was weird. And there were some others. And one thing that was alarming was I was losing my ability to read. The words, like I try to read the newspaper and words would just like jumble on the page and rearrange. And it was kind of like whenever you try to read in a dream. That I don't know if you've ever noticed that, or I think I read somewhere that whenever you try to read in a dream, words don't cooperate. And that was happening to me while I was awake. So that was distressing. That and the full-blown hallucinations. Another one, this was more of a cognitive imagination thing, that I was sitting there and I've called this thing the tribunal on several occasions. We should introduce that term. That on many occasions, particularly surrounding psychedelic experiences, I've been confronted by what I call the tribunal, and it asks questions and it wants split-second responses that are honest, that like whatever the first thing that pops into your head, they take as the answer. I'm not sure if that's a hard rule because I can't see or hear them. But at one point, sitting in my bedroom, the tribunal said, if you smoke one more cigarette, you will die. And that concerned me. And I was like, wow, this is, I don't know if I could handle the pressure of that like I now have to go the rest of my life without smoking a cigarette, or else I'm gonna like die here on the spot. So I resisted for a little bit, and eventually I'm like, this can't be real. I'm gonna smoke a cigarette and roll it up, light it up, take a drag. And when I do, I heard a gunshot. And the image in my mind was that of a man being executed. And that man may or may not have been myself. It was very unclear. And another one of the haunting hallucinations I was having in these days following the episode, I was having sex, and I can't make pictures in my mind. Like, is that aphantasia, or I don't know, there's a term for it. But while I was doing it, I could see I don't usually talk about this one out loud because of how disturbing it was, but in my mind, the act of me having sex in physical reality was analogous or parallel to or created, like how I was talking about the thought projections creating something somewhere else, that it made me into I don't know if it's a monster or an alien, or if just about any citizen of Earth would see the thing I saw, they would go, oh, hell no, kill it with fire, burn it, shoot it, cut it up into like, no, I ain't sharing a planet with that thing. It was not so much grotesque. It was dark. It had tentacles. There was sharp objects. It didn't. I don't think its form corresponded with our time space, and the act of me, I guess fornicating or doing it, its parallel was like destruction and or death or killing or. And I'm like, wow, this is like, is this what happens? Oh boy. Okay, so, and then another, just a random piece of information. I remember seeing the newspaper had an article about the Carnegie Museum having a exhibit about an artist, a photographer from McKeesport, and Dwayne Michaels. And I'm like, man, why have I never heard of Dwayne Michaels until this day? There's a famous guy from the town I pretend I grew up in, and I never heard of him until I was 32 years old. Okay, that's odd. Didn't make it to the exhibit, but his photos are pretty haunting or eerie, and it was interesting for the era that he was doing the work. So how did we get through all this? Well, I had to quit my job because I couldn't drive because of the cognitive impairment. I attempted to apply for Social Security income because I wasn't sure if or when my cognitive functioning would return. And it wasn't just the reading and the hallucinations. It was like I was kind of like a dim bulb for quite a while after that. It reminded me of Flowers for Algernon. That I didn't read Flowers for Algernon until I think years after that, but the being like going from like super sharp to like not sharp to barely being able to function. Yeah, I've done that. That it sucks, man. And I enrolled in mental health treatment voluntarily. They set me up with a therapist. I went to that for a couple of weeks. It wasn't doing any good, and I thought I needed meds because I was messed up. So I had to use the S word and the M word. And whenever you say that in the therapeutic setting, they're like, forget about that 6 months to see a psychiatrist. We'll get you in there next week or two. So that was nice. That's a little tip for you folks out there in case you need help and they're not giving it to you. You could escalate it using those taboo words. So when I finally got to meet the psychiatrist, I didn't like him, and he rubbed me the wrong way, and he was very condescending. In retrospect, I learned that I didn't like him because he reminded me of myself a lot. I'd never really met anybody that was like me, and this dude was totally like me, and it was frustrating. But so we did the tests, and then once again, also long story short, he put me on like a low dose of Seroquel, and then I wound up transferring to a different psychiatrist eventually, and that guy was like, this isn't even a high enough dose to be an antipsychotic, so like you've been taking a placebo of antihistamine for the last 2-3 months. And I was like, oh, so I'm like better. But the first psychiatrist, he was very insistent on me going to a 28-day rehab. I didn't want to do it. I was like, hey, how about I just quit drinking and doing drugs? And he's like, how about you go to rehab? And I was like, how about I quit? And I quit. I quit drinking. I quit smoking weed. I quit psychedelics, all of it. Like, the only drugs I kept was coffee and cigarettes. And that worked. And I spent the next 5.5 years clean off of everything but coffee and cigarettes. And there's other crazy stories that kind of like pick up where that one left off. And there's crazy stories before it. But I think that's kind of the thing. So the mental health treatment helped turn that around, and the artifact that I mentioned earlier was a letter. And I think I want to touch on this a little bit. Part of my delusions was that the notebooks I had, the words that I had written had meaning and power beyond being words on a page. I thought they like meant something or built something in, maybe a dimension we can't perceive or something. And pulling that out from under me was like there was no longer any ground to stand upon. So it felt like I was floating, and then I was terrified of writing in pen because I thought that the words had power and that it was my previous words that had put me in this bad spot. So I was terrified of recreating that situation. Now, eventually I did go on to like fill up some notebooks again and reestablish my theory of everything and all of that. But so what we have here is I thought it was a good idea to write an apology letter for the heresy that I had committed. And without further ado, to whom it may concern, I would like to offer a sincere apology to any deity I may have offended in my life. I am just a man, and I am humbled by anything that is more powerful than me. As a human, I don't have much power. All I have control over is my own actions. I have been a product of my environment. I controlled my environment in a negative way. I see the errors of my ways, and I wish to correct these grievous errors. I want to care for and bring joy to others. I want to lead a normal life. I am sorry for any pain I have caused to other individuals. I am willing to sacrifice the negative and/or destructive elements of my life in an effort to pursue a good life with my friends, family, and fellow humans. In short, I was wrong. Please forgive me. Sincerely, Randall. So, in summation, that's one of the biggest heresies that I have ever committed. Are there bigger heresies? I don't know. But it feels good getting that off my chest. I don't know. I don't... To rewind a little bit, I don't know what the point of me telling this story is. I'm kind of compelled. And I think like in some of these past ones, it's the making cave paintings, putting it on the shelf. I'm not telling this story. Oh, okay. Here's the moral. Shit, we almost forgot the important part. This insight didn't come until years later. Or maybe a year or two, I don't know. Well after this event occurred. I understood why it occurred. Those notebooks were everything to me. They meant more to me than, well, the only thing that meant more to me than those books was my life. So they were the only material object that I cared about. So, like anything else, car, clothing, home, whatever, burn it all. I don't care. Those books, if somebody would have stolen or destroyed those books and I was aware of that, it could have motivated me to the level of murder. I'm not a violent person, but I cared enough about those objects that I could have performed such an act. When those books were gone, that was my last remaining attachment to physical objects, and anything that could inspire me to hate was then gone. From that point forward, there was nothing worth. Now, and see, that's the thing. Before that, I didn't hate anyone. That hate would have been conditional upon damage or destruction or separation from this most valuable possession of mine. But as heartbreaking as the loss of them was, the liberation of growing into myself and my life after that event was indispensable. That, like, if I had to go through that again, I would. It was freaky, it was weird, but yeah. So I'm not trying to preach. This isn't like a cautionary tale of that you should or should not use psychedelics. I'm not trying to teach you anything. Like, Randall Vision is so that Randall could watch his stuff and maybe get a little catharsis and all that. Now, meanwhile, like this story in particular, I feel like I've dealt with it a lot internally, and I'll see if anything else shakes loose whenever I watch a playback of it. But I don't know. We'll let it go there. Remember, you're a sovereign individual. Do what thou wilt.